Welcome to Blended Learning. Our objectives: to understand the principles and benefits of blended learning, to clarify the technical and pedagogical aspects of blended learning, to deliver the blended program to students, and to adapt the teaching materials effectively for a blended session. So, what is blended learning? Blended learning is a blend of online learning combined with more traditional lessons with an instructor. In our blended program, students will prepare the e-lesson on CyberTeachers before the lesson, and then you, the instructor, will help confirm and activate what the student learned on CyberTeachers during your lesson with the student. There are numerous benefits to blended learning. Perhaps the most obvious is that students can study the foreign language anywhere, anytime, and at their own pace. The blended program can also be adapted to each student's individual needs and tailored to both the student and the instructor's initiative. And finally, the blended learning program allows the students to make the most of their time with the instructor by dedicating the majority of the phone lesson to performance activities such as role plays, structured conversation, and so on. As the student gets more speaking time during lessons, combined with the flexibility and autonomy of the program, students on blended learning programs progress faster in their target language than students taking more traditional face-to-face lessons. Now, before we go further into the theory of activating what the student learned in the e-lesson, let's first see how we can know if the student prepared the e-lesson or not. You can see this information on the student's profile page. You will see in the first column the name of the unit. Next, you'll see the name of the e-lesson, which is not always the same title as the unit. Then the most recent date the student worked on in that e-lesson and the percentage that they had completed. And finally, the student's writing activity will appear if the e-lesson included one. It's always a good idea to confirm on the student profile page if the student did the e-lesson or not. However, you can also just ask the student verbally during the lesson, "Did you do your e-lesson for this unit? Do you have a writing activity for me to check?" You can always confirm by going back to the student profile page. The foundation of the blended program lies in the students' e-lessons on CyberTeachers and the units they work on during lessons with an instructor. Each e-lesson on CyberTeachers is based on a correlating unit. Therefore, the grammar points and vocabulary that the student will learn and practice in the e-lesson will be the same as the grammar points and vocabulary that you see in the unit. As an example, in this case, the student is presented punctual, presentable, diligent, and productive in the e-lesson, and as you can see, the same vocabulary appears in the presentation phase of the unit. The best way to get familiar with the e-lesson content is to try a few yourself. Each e-lesson takes about 30 minutes to complete and can be stopped and restarted at any point of the e-lesson. The e-lessons on CyberTeachers follow the same PPP format as the units you use during lessons. Remember, PPP means presentation, practice, and performance. In the e-lesson, the student is first presented the new vocabulary and grammar. Then they will have opportunities to practice the new language with a variety of exercises. And finally, they will have a performance activity at the end. As we just saw, many times the performance activity is a writing activity that will appear on their net planning profile, so you can go over it together during the lesson. The PPP format. Therefore, there is overlap between the two types of learning, and you, the instructor, will need to adapt your lesson according to how well the student understands the new language they learned from the e-lesson. Let's first review how each lesson phase correlates to each part of the unit. The presentation phase is the illustration. The practice is the practice, and the performance is the transfer. These terms will vary according to the language you are teaching. We can break the practice up into two parts: more controlled practice and less controlled practice. The more controlled practice includes activities where there is little room for error, matching activities, fill-in-the-blank activities, etc. The less controlled practice will facilitate the more student speaking time. Oftentimes, the more controlled practice is practice 1 and 2 on the unit, and the less controlled practice is practice 3. Now we know that the student has already been presented the same language and has had many opportunities to practice that language during the e-lesson. What they do not have on CyberTeachers, however, is the opportunity to speak using the key language and to be corrected as needed. Therefore, the lesson time with the instructor should focus on the activities that conduce student speaking time, which would be the less controlled practice and performance activities. Ideal blended lesson structure. Here we can see an absolutely ideal lesson structure for a blended lesson with the instructor. After a short introduction, you set the goal for the lesson with the student. Next, you want to elicit what the student learned from the e-lesson and confirm the student can use the key language in their own words. For example, in the affirmative, negative, and interrogative forms. Depending on how well the student can use this language, you can do some additional practice before deciding the majority of the lesson to performance activities to activate what the student learned in the lesson. Finally, at the end of the lesson, be sure to leave a few minutes to confirm achievement of the goal and assign additional homework in the next e-lesson to prepare before the next lesson. We'll look at how to handle the main phases of a blended lesson now. First, instead of presenting the language again, as the student was already presented the same language in the e-lesson, we want to confirm the student can use the key language in their own words. You might need to clarify some points and support understanding. However, this will vary according to the student and the topic. A very effective way to elicit what the student learned is the method learning by teaching. With this method, the student teaches you, the instructor, the general rules and uses of the key language. You can then correct or clarify as needed. You can also ask the student for some examples in their own words of the key language. Be sure they can use the key language in a variety of forms: affirmative, negative, interrogative, past, future, etc. If the student can use the key language correctly, you can oftentimes skip the practice and go straight to the performance activities. However, if a student needs additional work on a certain point, for example, the past tenses of the new verbs, you might want to spend some time on additional practice. The practice phase. How you handle the practice phase will depend on your student and how well they can use the key language. Regardless, it's always a good idea to prioritize the less controlled practice activities that facilitate student speaking time. The more controlled the practice, such as matching activities, which make excellent additional homework for the student to complete after the lesson. If you do assign these activities for homework, be sure to note it in the lesson report, so you or the next instructor can check them in the next class. We'll continue with the performance phase. The priority of every blended lesson is the performance phase. These activities are based on real-world situations and allow the student to use the key language in a variety of ways. Each unit includes at least one performance activity. Therefore, you might need to adapt this activity in order to spend more time during the lesson on maximizing student talking time. You could, for example, repeat the role play with a complication or switch roles. You can also add a variety of other task-based performance activities, such as structured conversation, a friendly debate, or even a game such as 20 questions or taboo. Whatever gets the student speaking in the key language so they can achieve their goal for that lesson. Task-based conversation. Typically, the best goal for the lesson is the third objective from the unit that begins with "be able to." This goal should be adapted and customized to your students' language needs. Sometimes the objective is best achieved by having a structured conversation. For example, in this case, achievement of the goal to be able to talk about changes in technology can be measured by talking about changes in technology. Conversational lessons such as this will require structure and control from you, the instructor. There are two main principles to a successful conversational lesson. First, clarify the language you want your student to use in the conversation at the beginning of the lesson. This will be the language they learned from the e-lesson as well. In this case, we want the student to use technology vocabulary, passive tense, and adverbs describing change. Once the expectations are clarified, you might need to model the language points in the questions you ask, such as in the examples here. You might also need to ask your student to rephrase their response using the key language. For example, if your student responds in the active tense, ask them for the passive tense instead. After having a structured conversation where you have activated what the student learned in the e-lesson, be sure to refer back to this goal and have the student confirm that they can now talk about changes in technology. Confirming achievement of the lesson goal is vital for bringing awareness of what the student has accomplished in a short amount of time. FAQs. Before we go, let's discuss 3 common questions regarding the blended program. Number 1, sometimes students do not have time to complete their e-lesson. That's okay. In this case, it is still a good idea to elicit what they already know about the key language and otherwise teach as you would in a non-blended lesson. Number 2, some students might need additional presentation and practice for more difficult grammar points and vocabulary. In this case, you should spend more time on the presentation and practice activities during the lesson. Set a more achievable goal for the lesson and be sure to assign additional homework so the student can get more practice as well. The best way to motivate students, number 3, is to complete their e-lesson, is to recognize the work they have done on CyberTeachers and draw awareness to the benefit of faster progress and better understanding. The best motivation is adapting your lesson when the student did do the e-lesson and making it clear that e-lesson work done before class leads to more student speaking time and conversational activities in the lesson with you, the instructor. We hope you've enjoyed our module on blended learning.